Okay, I'm going to start with a few questions I have. The question is from Mr. Muhammad Gausul Azam. He is an AIT student. And his question is, does your question, can the US lead itself give dominance to the Mr. Clinton's government? Does your question itself give a dominance to Mr. Clinton's government? Maybe it's now Bush, but I think the issue started during the Clinton's time. Is that the idea?
I still don't understand the question.
Okay. You say that your question itself, the can US lead, does it not give the dominance to the US government itself right away, identifying that way?
Well, I still don't understand the question, but let me try to answer anyway. My question precisely is this, I said, there is a unipolar world with one major superpower, unchallenged, at least in economic military superiority, as we know. And then the question is, but can it lead the world? Well, I'm not going to answer that question either. I provided a lot of additional questions, and I hope that the U.S. leaders, are able to provide us with some hopes, some trust, because it is a major responsibility for the only superpower in the world. They have the economic might, they have the military power, the technology, the resources, but also their well-being. Their wealth depends on stability and prosperity of the rest of the world. Are they going to be enlightened enough to work with the rest of the world in alleviating poverty, in creating peace and stability? And I emphasize the word, are they going to be able to work with the rest of the world? Leadership is building consensus. Leadership is persuading. Leadership is not bulldozing people into agreeing with you out of fear. They might go along with you, but in resentment.
Thank you. The next question, they're not in any particular order, but I'm trying to group them, is from a friend from Denmark, Mr. Mogen Hanse. He asks, do you have a series of questions to those countries in the world that claim to have a special role in the world given by God or some other power in nature? I also have a difficulty understanding the question. Is the speaker here, the person asking the question? Huh? Is he around? So can you ask this question? Because what we want to know is whom are you referring to? Yes, please.
Yeah. My question is that some nations in the world claim that they have a special God-given role to do something to the world. I will not mention these nations here, but there are a group of them. Have you a series of questions for them that can make them think a little bit before they make these claims?
Well, it reminds me, of a not so famous U.S. evangelist, missionary, called Oral Roberts. One day he woke up and he said that he had just spoken with God. And God told him to raise $100 million for his church. So he appealed on television to all his followers to come up with $100 million within 6 months. Otherwise, he would have to jump from some 40th floor office tower. Well, 6 months later, he had managed only some $10 million. God came back to him and said, don't jump, and that's enough.
Thank you. Very well.
Many of his followers were actually hoping that he would actually jump. And, but anyway, frankly, I don't take too seriously those who claim to speak for God or God have spoken to them, and they are supposed to be the chosen children of God. And, you know, I don't take it seriously. The problem is some of them, they themselves take it seriously. And they actually believe that they have a God-given mission to carry out certain missions in the world with God's mandate. And that's what becoming very serious. And they seem to be believing it.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think there are enough questions about God itself, so I think let's not get into the another topic. We already have a very important question: can the US lead? So we'll stick to that topic. Maybe we'll have some other speaker who will speak about God. The question next is from Mr. Shankar from India. Why it took so many years for East Timor to get freedom? Was the internal support insufficient?
Well, I would say this. Yes, it took us, the last chapter in the struggle was 25 years. Before that was Japanese occupation, and before that Portuguese colonization. So it was not only the 25 years of Indonesian occupation. And it took a long time, partly, well, East Timor is a small dot in the world, isolated geographically, victim of the Cold War, victim of indifference that came from ignorance. Media didn't report about it, so if media doesn't report about it, difficult to educate and mobilize, first, public opinion, and second, government into action. This is what, but we persisted, believing in the UN system, keeping the issue alive on the UN, knocking at doors. I traveled to about 100 countries, have spoken to audiences. One day, someone thought it would be a brilliant idea for me to go to speak in a conference somewhere in Chicago. So I went, and a friend managed to get me invited to speak in a workshop. I went into that workshop with a New Zealander academic working in the United States, Roger Clark, and because I enlisted him as a respected academic to join me, with some 10, 15 old ladies, Afro-Americans, walk into our workshop. I immediately was suspicious that they probably didn't know what they were walking into. Someone probably herded them in a bus, okay, you go to this workshop. And as I talked, they were falling asleep. And because they were falling asleep, I talked even more softly. I didn't want to wake them up. Well, in the end, actually, I found out they had come into the wrong workshop. They didn't know what it was all about, because someone told them, well, you have to fill that room. And because they were retired ladies, they had an excursion, so they brought them to. So I had these experiences. As I went to New Orleans one day, invited by someone to give a speech, ended up with some 5 or 6 people in the audience. And what I decided to do was take them all out for a coffee instead of being in a university room. My point is, it took us a lot of years of patience, understanding the constraints, the difficulties, and we do not resent those who were against us. Recently, a few months ago, I went into the US National Day at the US Embassy, and there was a vigil by Timorese NGOs, reminding of US alleged complicity in the Timor tragedy. A journalist asked me what I thought of that. I said, well, if they want to hold vigils in front of each embassy for their direct or indirect complicity over Timor, well, they might have it to hold vigils at least once a week at some embassy in Timor or around the world. And that was the reality of the Cold War. But then came the internet age, came the global television, the CNN phenomenon, and others that followed CNN, made the world much smaller, and we have witnessed in the last 10, 20 years the emergence of a phenomena that I would say, a new force in international relations, and that is civil society. No longer policies are made only by an exclusive group of people. Civil society increasingly are determining the agenda or influencing the agenda, be it World Bank, the UN, governments. And we were freed largely because of the civil society around the world. If it were not for that, we could be still a great people fighting heroically, but still fighting. No end in sight. And I keep reminding our youth in Timor, let us not forget that there are other nations equally courageous, equally tenacious, and yet are not free. So we, without the international community, international solidarity, civil society, we still will be fighting today. Heroically as ever, but still fighting without freedom.
Thank you. Actually, I'm flooded with questions, and keeping in mind, I must apologize, we will not be able to read all the questions, but I think the reception will follow, so some of you can follow. But I have few more questions because His Excellency has another appointment in the town, and we need to give him time also to recover and prepare for the next one. The question is from Gerard Thompson, Passport and Life. The question says, you're naming only one leader. You named Mahatma Gandhi. How many divisions could he have? And in how many, and in this, how many would have died?
How many divisions?
Yeah, well, you were talking of military might, so how many divisions he had?
Well, in electing Mahatma Gandhi as my, I would say probably the only real great leader I have, is precisely because he proved the earlier point I made. Yes, the might of nations over centuries was illustrated, sustained by how much economic or military might they had. But Mahatma Gandhi proved one thing, that the power of ideas, the power of convictions, sometimes overcome empires. They survive. We still hear, and many emulate Mahatma Gandhi's vision. Many others are forgotten. So that's why well, he didn't have any, division as such. He had a civilian divisions of 300 million who were prepared not to obey the empire. And the empire broke down, collapsed. A few months ago, 2 years ago, I don't remember exactly, I was on an interview live online, BBC, and a question came from Gaza. And I always hesitate to give advice, lectures to anyone, because who am I, But since a question came from Gaza, instigating me to say something about the Palestinian struggle, I said something more or less along these lines. Imagine one day 3 or 4 million Palestinians drop all forms of violence and pursue Mahatma Gandhi's strategy of civil disobedience. You would achieve far more than the Intifada that has brought so much destruction to Palestine. What would the state of Israel, with all its F-16s, do to 4 million people sitting and refusing to cooperate?
Thank you. There is a related question, Your Excellency, from Ms. Ethan from AIT. Why didn't the US government intervene in the Middle East conflict since the UN has voted many resolutions against Israel?
Why the US does not intervene?
Yeah, why did not intervene, yes.
Well, I can give you a cynical answer. The cynical answer is that there has not been a Security Council resolution authorizing an intervention in Middle East, in Palestine. You know, and you know why there will be no Security Council resolution authorizing intervention there. But let's also, you know, be fair. You know, when you look at the UN, when you hear the Israeli side view the UN as an enemy, because every year, I don't know the countless number of resolutions that are adopted on the Palestinian issue. But you hear the Palestinians and many Arabs criticizing the UN for not doing enough on the Palestinian issue. They are referring to the Security Council. You have this dual institution in the UN, one that functions through majority vote, whereby an overwhelming majority every year vote on resolutions, wide range of resolutions in support of the Palestinian cause. And then you go to Security Council. More often than not, it is any initiative in Security Council that's critical of Israel is blocked by at least one veto or more, sometimes two or three, but usually it would be the US. But let's also be fair to the US, you know, and maybe let me be undiplomatic and provocative towards the Arab world and the Europeans, you know. Middle East is traditionally, geographically, historically, a region that is of immediate concern, interest of the Europeans. What have the Europeans done in relation to Middle East, to Palestinian question? Why it has to be always the US having to come in? And why not the Arab League, besides the annual meetings or the frequent meetings of the foreign ministers, promising the liberation of Jerusalem, and beyond that, what? Well, is it the inability, the failure of the Arab leadership or Palestinian leadership or the Europeans? No, again, you know, it is not that simple. I would say, you know, and I have many Palestinian friends, and I tell you one thing. We have established diplomatic relations with the State of Israel. End of this month, end of February, the Palestinian representative in Canberra is traveling to Timor to present his credentials as full-rank ambassador of Palestine in Timor. So we recognize both the State of Israel and the Palestine as full sovereign entities. So very balanced position. But at the same time, I would say probably, my humble view, and I'm prepared to be flogged by the Palestinians for making this outrageous remark, but maybe the Palestinians should rethink or should ask themselves, why 50 years after the outbreak of the Palestinian struggle, the beginning of the Palestinian struggle of Palestinian diaspora, they are still there with no end in sight? Is to blame Israel, the US, or Palestinian leadership must ask themselves some uncomfortable questions. What has been in their struggle, their strategy, their methods that have not generated, mobilized the millions of people around the world that usually would flock to the streets in support of just causes? Is it not because people feel uncomfortable about the methods of abductions, of killings, of innocent Israeli civilians? I tell you one thing, if ever in my country, I was in exile abroad, the leadership in my country, leading the struggle, had adopted similar tactics, systematic targeting of civilians, innocent Indonesian children, women, school teachers, I would have told my compatriots, goodbye, I don't want to be part of this country. I will not be part of a cause, will be part of an organization, a community, a country that use violence so indiscriminately. So, and I warn my compatriots repeatedly, you do it and I'll be out. I'm not as great as Mahatma Gandhi or as Martin Luther King. In the sense, I oppose that they oppose violence of any form. I don't. I'm realistic enough to think that sometimes against evil, like in the case of Nazi Germany, force was necessary. Again, I applauded, and maybe I should not be deserving of the Nobel Peace Prize, because I applauded Vietnam intervention in Cambodia to save the Cambodian people. So I say, I'm far too small to compare with Mahatma Gandhi or Martin Luther King in terms of their beliefs, their sacred beliefs in nonviolence. But, yes, I would oppose any organization, any group of individuals that engage in systematic violence as a means to achieve their goals. They should not deserve to be free, to be independent. And the case of Palestine, obviously, we cannot generalize, between some extremist minority elements that time and again try to undermine, to sabotage the peace process that is led by, supported by the mainstream Palestinian society and Palestinian leaders.
Thank you, Eric. There is a slightly different issue which you referred to. The question comes from Professor Jain, who is visiting here. It says, sir, do you think with the advent of WTO, the conditions in the developing countries would further deteriorate? Sir, do you think there should be another Mahatma Gandhi who is born in USA?
The second question, yes, I think so it should. I wish God would generate more Mahatma Gandhis. India should not have another
one, no need. India doesn't need the second one, no?
No, should not have a monopoly on Mahatma Gandhi. He has become a universal symbol. But yes, maybe the Middle East needs someone like Mahatma Gandhi. Maybe some countries in Asia need someone like Mahatma Gandhi. But the US had a great leader, and yet they assassinated him, and it was Martin Luther King. And then came John F. Kennedy. They killed him. Then came aspiring president Robert Kennedy. They killed him. So, and the first question, I'm not an economist. I cannot answer this question in seriousness, but I would not subscribe entirely to the view that globalization in itself has been detrimental to the poorest of the world. Many, if we compare the world today, what it is today in 2002 with what it was 30 years ago in terms of people's purchasing power, material well-being, in remote places like my country and elsewhere that I have been to, far better. Greater access to electricity, to communications. People who 30 years ago could not even afford to ride a bicycle. Today they have a motorbike or a car. In my own childhood, myself personally, I dreamed to have a bicycle to impress my girlfriend. Whoever had a bicycle in Timor had a certain social status. Today, I had an old worker, he's now in his 50s or 60s, because he comes to ask me money all the time. I say, okay, as of now, I'm not giving you any money, you come and work here. So he come and work in my garden. And how does he come to work? He come by taxi. And I saw him walking off a taxi. Well, 30 years ago, no, he could not afford a taxi, he could not afford a bicycle. Now, there have been some changes. The number of poor have increased, but qualitatively, the quality of life of many has improved as well.
Thank you. I'm going to ask the last question, and I apologize to all those who have submitted questions because keeping the time in mind. And this refers to your fellow Nobel Peace Laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi. She is still under house arrest. Burma has been ruled by military group. What are your suggestions? US, UN, or international community can help to make her free and help the people of Myanmar?
Well,
this is a question from, I'm sure he's a fellow from Myanmar. The name reads U Tin Than with the WWF here in Thailand.
Well, I happen to know reasonably well the issue in Myanmar. Over the years, socialized, met, discussed with many democracy movement leaders and their supporters around the world, have spoken out, written about the need for dialogue, reconciliation, democracy in Myanmar. 2 or 3 years ago, as you know, there was some promise of changes in Myanmar. Suu Kyi was released. Many of her followers, delegates were released. NLD offices were reopened. A maybe slow, timid dialogue had started. 2 years ago, I met with some European leaders during the ASEAN meeting in Madrid. And I advised them, based on our experience in East Timor, that sanctions cannot always be an end in itself. It might be politically correct, might create good image, publicity for us with the NGO community, Amnesty International, the media, but we always have to ask ourselves whether it is the right approach. In the case of East Timor, we never argue for sanctions against Indonesia. Well, for 2 simple reasons. One, no one would listen anyway, so why wasting your time? We went for selective sanctions strategy, which worked in terms of curtailing US and British weapons sales to Indonesia. And we succeeded in stopping several of them. Far more effective than actually trying to shoot Indonesian soldiers on the ground. We just stopped the weapons that enable them to carry a war. And we did lobby in the US Congress to that effect and succeeded. But we never went for economic, financial sanctions, except in '99 at the height of the crisis. And on the South African case during apartheid, financial sanctions were effective because it went to the institutions themselves, the banking and financial institutions in South Africa. It did not, there were no sweeping general sanctions that would harm in the end the majority of black South Africans. South Africa succumbed to international pressure because of the targeted sanctions on the banking and financial sectors. In the case of Myanmar, when I read in the media that the US imposed new sanctions that would prevent Myanmar from exporting something like $300 million in goods to the US, I ask myself, you know, as a human being, and I can visualize, imagine the poor farmers, street vendors in Myanmar. Are these ones that are going to suffer? If these are the ones that are going to suffer, I don't want them to suffer. Is it really going to harm the military? I don't know. You know, I ask myself. I was in Bali soon after the October terrorist bombing of 2 years ago, and seeing the isolation of the, emptiness of the airport and the streets, and you saw thousands of Balinese who could no longer afford to earn a living, I felt heartbroken because of those people. And then I imagined, when the sanctions on Burma came, I imagined the same people in the streets of Yangon that would have lost their livelihood. And I told the European leaders, please look at the situation in Myanmar today. If the Burmese military have released Suu Kyi, have released other detainees, you must also proportionally lift some of the restrictions and sanctions. You must set up benchmarks and encourage them to change, they improve, you go along with it. If we continue the sanctions, well, we are harming the poor, and we are not encouraging those in Myanmar inside the system that probably are the ones who are forcing the changes. Am I right? Well, I share with you my thoughts. I fully support the Bangkok process initiated by the foreign minister that seemed to be going very slowly and with promise. From what I have read in the media, talking with people, there are positive signals, signs coming out of Myanmar. With patience, one step at a time, it is possible for us to see Suu Kyi released soon and to see a serious dialogue, maybe this year, a national convention to draft a constitution taking place with the participation of all. But we must not focus only on Suu Kyi. The problem in Myanmar is far more complex with, I don't know, more than 100 ethnic groups and so on, and many of them armed groups. Not easy for Suu Kyi or anyone to handle, to manage this complex situation there. So that's what I would say.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. I think we have one. Please take a seat, I think. Take a little rest. I'm going to request Professor Mario Tabukonan, Provost AIT, to propose a vote of thanks.
Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, I am very honored and delighted to have the privilege to speak and to convey the vote of thanks of the Asian Institute of Technology and to all those who have listened to the very outstanding lecture of His Excellency Professor Jose Ramos-Horta. I express the profound appreciation and deep gratitude to His Excellency for a very outstanding lecture, and also to the International Peace Foundation for making this lecture possible. I would also like to thank the Kasikorn Bank, the main sponsor of this particular event, and the other sponsors as listed there, Doset, Unocal, Ogilvy, Honda, and Thai International, for making contributions to make this lecture possible. At the very outset, His Excellency was very modest, very humble in saying that possibly the topic that he was going to give a lecture is very controversial and very delicate. But I think after listening to His Excellency, we can say with confidence that you are an authority in the topic, Your Excellency, and we're very proud that we have the privilege to share and to listen to the wisdom that you have shared with us. His Excellency was very neat in presenting his views when he structured his talk so elegantly by first describing a world order of unipolarism, a new world order in which a superpower, one nation, dominates the world, and he posed a question whether that nation can lead to peace, not to war. And he, of course, ask many other questions, corollary questions, for us to ponder with all his wealth of experience in sharing with us his observations on what's happening around the world, in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, and the rest of the world, for us to learn lessons and perhaps answer the questions ourselves, the questions that he posed. But I think in summation, you would agree with me that the answer towards our quest for global peace is actually what is the theme that the International Peace Foundation is propagating, and that is bridges. To build bridges, to build dialogues towards a culture for peace in which the peoples of the world will be able to achieve peace if we understand each other and if we share each other's values and we dialogue until we reach peace. So in conclusion, again, Your Excellency, we are so proud and privileged to have the benefit of your wisdom, and I would like to invite the President of AIT, Professor John Louis Armand, to present a token of appreciation to Your Excellency for all the time and effort that you have spent with us. So may I request Your Excellency to please rise, and also request the President to come on stage to present our token of appreciation on behalf of AIT and on behalf of all of us who are here.